On today's Join Us in France, why is Napoleon buried at Les Invalides? This is Join Us in France, episode 135. Bonjour, I'm Annie, and today I'm doing a solo episode because I just got really curious about why Napoleon was buried at Les Invalides and not in some other place in Paris because, well, I'll get into that in a minute. There would have been really good reasons to not bury him there, and yet there he is. Before I start talking about Napoleon and Les Invalides today, I want to say thank you very much to new Patreon donors Mitch Guzman and Dorothy Kangas. Lunch Break French, the exclusive content patrons get each month, is going to come out this week. A few days late, I apologize about that, but the holidays have been wonderful, haven't they? This month is going to be all about the French words that are commonly used in English and how to say them if you would like to actually say them correctly in French. I've come to find out sometimes it's not the right time to say them correctly in French, even if you know how, but it's good to know how, right? To join the many wonderful Patreon supporters of the show, go to patreon.com/join us, and Patreon is spelled Patreon. Many thanks to the supporters who started donating several months back. I cannot name all of you each episode, but I know who you are, and thank you. I hope you feel good about doing that. You should feel good about doing that. I hope you do. Today, I also want to thank the people who have written iTunes review recently. My Girl 19 from the United States says, fantastique, 5 stars. This podcast was great for both before and after our trip to Paris. There were so many museums I would have missed if not for hearing about them here. Thank you. Well, thank you for your review. Very nice to hear that you enjoyed listening to the show. There's been so many reviews. Let me see. Let me read a couple more at least. Another person called Suibol from the United States also gives the show 5 stars, says, I've listened to 5 or 6 so far, informative and fun, nice conversational tone. The one on Moulin Rouge had 2 tourists who had been there for a show. Both gave the pros and cons from their point of view. Both sides tipped me into not making a reservation. Oops, maybe that's not what I wanted to do. Well, I don't care. You go, you don't go. It doesn't change anything for me. Thanks for the helpful tips for those planning a trip, as I am. A couple of suggestions. Any travel or Paris app you would particularly recommend? Yes, I will heartily recommend the RATP transportation app. It is the official app and it works really well. And if your phone is set in English, the app will also install in English, and it's really, really helpful. There are a ton of others, and I need to write a blog post about this. We'll get to it very soon. Also, she asks how to dress to at least sort of fit in with the locals and the weather. Well, how to fit in is a really hard question. For women, I would say scarves are always really helpful. No shorts, and sneakers are okay, but try to not get the brightest, like, I'm here kind of sneakers. That's what I would recommend. But again, maybe I'll do a blog post with the help of the listeners with some tips on all of that, because I'm really not a fashionista, so it's hard for me to think of stuff like that off the top of my head. Another one by DDBPDX says, indispensable. 5 stars also. I love this podcast. I will be visiting Paris for the first time this spring, and I have found this podcast indispensable. I keep a notebook open while listening to note all of the tips and suggestions that will be useful for my trip. I love the mix of history, culture, and insider tips. I have listened to about 10 episodes so far, but can't wait to listen to all of them. Wow. There are some people who start with episode 1 and work all the way up to like 135 today. That's just amazing to me. I am so grateful that people feel like they need this information and they would want to listen to us that long. It's fantastic. Okay, one last review by Jason Roberts. Hey, Jason Roberts, hi. Annie and Elise are incredibly informative, helpful, entertaining. I appreciate the local perspective and casual approach to the visitor experience in France. I've binged in every episode, some a few times more. Wow. I'm grateful for all the time and energy these travel podcasters put into this effort. Thanks again. Well, thank you, listeners, for putting up with me and for listening thus far. Let's see if I can entertain you and also give you some tips about Les Invalides. Now, if you like this episode, you will also like, I think, which one was it? I'm going to have to go look it up now. Episode 58, Napoleon in Paris. And on the Facebook group, we've had lots of fun conversation. We have a few faithful listeners who are in France right now, and so they post pictures on the Facebook closed group. The actual Facebook page for the show, nothing much is happening there. I recommend that you go to the Facebook, so it's called Join Us in France Closed Group. And you have to ask to join because it's a closed group. But there's lots of conversation, lots of discussion going on there. Now, let me give you this caveat. If you barely joined Facebook just to join the group, then send me an email. It's annie@joinusinfrance.com to let me know before you join, because I get so many spammers who these are robots that create these Facebook profiles, and they just join as many groups as they can, and they just post whatever spam they have. It's like get rich quick schemes or some guru or some person who wants to find a sugar daddy or something like that. Anyway, so if you just barely joined Facebook, automatically I will not only deny your request, but I will block you from making the request again, because again, these are bots and they can request it as many times as they want. I usually just change the names, and anyway, it's a huge pain in the wazoo. I have to chase down all these idiots. Like I get at least 20-30 bogus requests per day. So if I didn't accept you, but you are a real person and you really want to join the group, just send me an email, annie@joinusinfrance.com, and I'll obviously let you in. I'm just only worried about keeping the spammers away. Okay, let's get into the meat of this interesting topic. As you probably know, Napoleon Bonaparte, his importance in French history and life is really difficult to overestimate. Yet, very surprisingly, we haven't really talked about him much on Join Us in France, besides in episode 58, that was called Napoleon in Paris. And that talked about all the things that Napoleon had changed in Paris that have made it such a nice place. Why haven't we talked about Napoleon before on the show? Well, it has everything to do with the fact that it's a really complicated subject, and it's really impossible to do it justice without going on and on and on and on and being a little bit more scholarly than is ideal for my taste. But Napoleon has left his mark in almost every aspect of French culture and history, so we cannot ignore him. So let's start the year by gently dipping our toes into Napoleon and ask this simple question. Why is Napoleon buried at Les Invalides? Why there? Why not somewhere else? All right, so the first thing we need to talk about is how did Napoleon meet his demise? Napoleon died in exile on May 5th, 1821. He was on the island of Saint Helena, which is a British island in the middle of freaking nowhere. It's in the South Atlantic Ocean. It's 2,000 miles east of Rio de Janeiro and 1,200 miles west of the coast of Africa. This lovely hole in the ground has only recently gotten an airport. It's an airstrip, really, I think. So early 2016 is when they opened the airport. So now you can go there a little faster, but it used to be by boat only. So it was really, really far away. How did Napoleon end up at St. Helena is really a long story. It's complicated, but one thing is for sure. Whereas he had escaped from exile in the island of Elba, which is off the coast of Tuscany, escaping from St. Helena was going to be another matter entirely. And actually, he never managed. He spent almost the last 6 years of his life at St. Helena, and he died there. Let's talk a little bit about the fall of Napoleon. And I'm going to oversimplify things a lot, but I just want to give us the gist of the history. Here's the bottom line. Military defeats are what ended Napoleon's rule. There was the terrible loss in Russia, then the retreat, there was awful human loss, and the emperor was broke. Napoleon was in a terribly weak spot, and political shenanigans flourished. He tried to commit suicide with a pill, but that did not work. Then he tried to abdicate in favor of his son, but the powers that be, which were essentially European rulers that Napoleon had been pushing around for 20 years, who finally saw the end of this dangerous strongman, well, they would have none of it. They didn't let him step down, let's put it that way. In the Treaty of Fontainebleau, the victors, they decided to banish Napoleon to Elba, a small island, like I said, about 10 miles away from Tuscany. He went. He didn't go willingly, but he went. The conditions were really plush at Elba. He was given 2 million francs a year allowance. He got a 21-gun salute when he arrived. He, of course, immediately started plotting his comeback. Not even 1 year into his banishment to Elba, he comes back to Paris with the aid of his former troops, and Louis XVIII, who was on the throne at that time, flees the throne in fear for his life. Yes, he was a coward. So for 100 days in 1815, Napoleon rules France again. He takes this opportunity to go fight the British at Waterloo because, that's what Napoleon did. He was always on the offense, and he was just this fighter who wouldn't quit. And this time, like in Russia, he loses big. It was the second major defeat after this Russian campaign. And that's when the British sent him off to the island of St. Helena, in the middle of nowhere, where presumably it would be a lot harder for him to escape. And that worked. He never escaped. The conditions were nowhere as plush at St. Helena as they had been at Elba. There's one account that I'm going to read you by Le Comte de las Cases. He was a friend of Napoleon. He had served with Napoleon. He was a confidant, but he was also there. So I guess he's an eyewitness of what happened. And he wrote extensively about this. Let me read you just a tiny bit. The Emperor Napoleon, who lately possessed such boundless power and disposed of so many crowns, now occupies a wretched hovel, a few feet square, which is perched upon a rock, unprovided with furniture, and without either shutters or curtains to the windows. Now, being a Frenchman, if you don't have shutters and curtains, you are just heartened. We don't like that. We won't put up with that for 1 minute. As a matter of fact, that's the one thing that really bothered me about American homes, is that they didn't have shutters. At least in the West where I lived, I just wanted shutters. And so when we build a house, I went looking for shutters, and I realized that American shutters are just decorative. They're good for nothing. You can't close them. What's the point? This place must serve him for bedchamber, dressing room, dining room, study, and sitting room. And he is obliged to go out when necessary to have this one apartment cleaned. Oh, well, he's lucky he didn't have to clean it himself. His meals, consisting of a few dishes, are brought to him from a distance as though he were a criminal in a dungeon. I don't see what that has to do with it. Just because they bring his meals from a distance. Anyway, he is absolutely in want of the necessities of life. The bread and wine are not only not such as he had been accustomed to, well, yeah, but are so bad that we loathe to touch them. Water, coffee, butter, oil, and other articles are either not to be procured or are scarcely fit for use. Well, if it's bad butter, I understand. I mean, I complain too if the butter's bad. We were all assembled around the emperor, and he was recapitulating the facts with warmth. For what infamous treatment are we reserved? He exclaimed. This is the anguish of death. To injustice and violence they now add insult and protracted torment. If I were so hateful to them, why did they not get rid of me? A few musket balls into my head or my heart would have done the business, and there would have at least been some energy in their crime. Were it not for you, and above all for your wives, I would receive nothing from them but the pay of a private soldier. I have no idea what that means. I guess he's complaining that he's being treated like a private soldier. But what about the wives? I'm not sure what he meant. Anyway, how can the monarchs of Europe permit the sacred character of sovereignty to be violated in my person? Well, dude, they didn't like you. That's why. They do not see that they are, with their own hands, working their own destruction at St. Helena. Oh, that's what he was trying to say. If you treat me this badly, someday somebody else will treat you this badly. I get it. I entered their capitals victorious, and had I cherished such sentiments, what would have become of them? They styled me their brother, and I had become so by the choice of the people and the sanction of victory, the character of religion, and the alliances of their policy and their blood. Do they imagine that the good sense of nations is blind to their conduct? Yeah. And what do they expect from it? At all events, make your complaints, gentlemen. Let indignant Europe hear them. Complaints from me would be beneath my dignity and character. So, in other words, I'm telling you what to say when you complain about the way I've been treated, but it's beneath me to do the complaining myself. I must either command or be silent. Okay, he was a piece of work, Napoleon. We know that, right? There's no question there. Okay, so what killed Napoleon? Okay, the conditions were less than rosy for Napoleon at St. Helena, but what killed him? And that's a really hard question to answer definitively. Napoleon's British physician, and I didn't write down his name, but I can find it again, on St. Helena, he complained that the emperor was being treated too harshly and that the climate didn't suit him. But, there were no signs of beating or anything like that. Yeah. On the other hand, his early demise wouldn't have bothered the British so much. It was convenient, to say the least, because he was only 51 when he died. Or 52, maybe. So the British were really highly motivated not to give him plush surroundings. And besides, he had abused it the first time. So, yeah, there you go. There are always conspiracy theories concerning every aspect of the life and death of Napoleon. People say stuff like he must have been poisoned, and yeah, there was a lot of arsenic in his hair samples, but he was also exposed to too much arsenic as a child, and we know that because they had hair samples throughout his life, so they know that the abnormal levels of arsenic started very early. But whatever the case may be, arsenic is really not likely the cause of Napoleon's death. There were also other poisons, obviously, and the poison conspiracies will never go quiet. But there was an autopsy done on Napoleon's body, and that autopsy pointed out stomach cancer and a nasty stomach ulcer. I have a grandfather who died of a stomach ulcer. Back then, they didn't really know how to treat that very well, at least in France. But the physician who did Napoleon's autopsy did not sign his report. So we don't know if he didn't sign it because he forgot or because he was pressured into saying that Napoleon died of cancer. We have no idea, and we will never know. Stomach cancer was a convenient explanation, actually, especially for the British jailers. But it also turned out that Napoleon's father also died of stomach cancer, and that fact was not known at the time. So that lends credibility to the story. So I'm going to go with cancer, but of course, I don't know for sure. Napoleon's original resting place. Napoleon was explicit about where he wanted to be buried. He wrote, Je souhaite reposer au bord de la Seine, au milieu de ce peuple français que j'ai tant aimé, which translates to, I wish to be laid to rest by the river Seine, surrounded by the people of France that I loved so much. Well, his English jailers denied him that wish and buried him at St. Helena in an unmarked grave, which is not nice. Now, let me annoy my British listeners a little bit. I have to say, that was not classy and that was not necessary either. I understand that he was the big bad wolf and that they were really glad to be done with him, but once dead, he wasn't much of a threat anymore, especially since he had no heir that was fit to claim his legacy. He had children. Let's look at that situation for just a second. He married Josephine, and she had children from a previous marriage, and Napoleon had adopted those children, but they never had children together. So Napoleon and Josephine never had any children together. Those children that Napoleon adopted didn't have a claim to anything. Napoleon also had affairs, and he fathered children outside of marriage, but as you know, that doesn't count either. He then divorced Josephine, reportedly and apparently explicitly, to marry a younger woman who could give him children, and this woman was royal. She was royal, and she was from Austria, and he was hoping to produce an heir, which they did. They had a son, one son. They named him Napoléon Francis Joseph Charles. A fine French name, if I've ever heard one. But everybody called him Le Roi de Rome, the King of Rome, from his birth. And that was an old name that German rulers inherited all the way back from the 11th century. So that was old. But this kid was named that. And in spite of his grand lineage, this boy, Le Roi de Rome, only ruled for 2 weeks, and he died at age 21 from tuberculosis. So he was really no threat. So by throwing Napoleon's body in an unmarked grave, I think the English overreacted, and maybe they helped a little bit making a martyr out of Napoleon in the eyes of the common people. You know, the common people, they're always with the rulers. You know, they like a strong man, and they certainly liked Napoleon a lot. And I think history would have proceeded differently if they had just given the body back right away and told the French, look, here he is, dead, deal with him, deal with his image, his legacy, deal with the whole thing, we don't want anything to do with him. But the British wanted to keep control of Napoleon's remains, and also Louis XVIII in France. He knew that Napoleon's return, even dead, would cause a commotion. So Napoleon's ashes stayed at St. Helena for 18 plus years, and there were attempts to bring his body back, but they all failed until 1840. On and off, French people, French rulers, talked about, and the deputies, the députés, talked about bringing the body back. Took until 1840 for them to succeed. On May 23rd and 26th, 1840, la Chambre des députés, so that's the deputies' chamber, presided by Maréchal Clausel, came to an agreement on where the remains of Napoleon should reside in Paris. Because the matter was not just, shall we get him back? That was one thing, but where do we put him when we get him back? The possible resting places that they considered were thus: Le Pantheon, where so many French greats are buried; La Madeleine, the church, La Madeleine, where nobody famous was buried at the time, and it could have become Napoleon's own resting place. A third one was the Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile, so the Arc de Triomphe, the one at the very top of the Champs-Élysées. It was built in honor of Napoleon's great army. Many of Napoleon's generals were already named on the building. You can read all their names. You can read all the names of Napoleon's campaigns, all his victories, because here I only talked about, the two nastiest defeats. But Napoleon had a ton of victories before he got to those defeats, right? So Arc de Triomphe would have been a natural place for him to be. Another one, fourth one, is La Colonne de la Place Vendôme. Okay, so this one is interesting because it's not much to look at, but the way it was created. Napoleon had this habit of, when he captured an army, defeated somebody, he would capture their cannons. And he had a bunch of these cannons melted to build this bronze column. And so that would have been a fitting reminder of Napoleon's military victories, right? The fifth place was the Saint-Denis, the basilica, where many, many French kings are buried, and it's a place for rulers, obviously. And the sixth is Les Invalides, a solemn place full of historical significance and right by the Seine River. Well, actually, if you're walking between the Seine River and Napoleon's grave, you have about 1 kilometer. But, all right, let's grant him that. He's not right on the river banks. He's 1 kilometer away. Why did Napoleon like Les Invalides? Well, he liked them. He liked this place in three ways that are significant to this. He asked for new generals who had served under Louis XIV to be brought into Les Invalides for their final resting place. So he thought of the place as a fitting final resting place for these great generals. He also commissioned the addition of the flags that represent 100 French military victories. When you visit Les Invalides and you visit the grave, that's what you're going to see. Look up and you're going to see a bunch of flags. Well, Napoleon is the one who wanted them there. And they represent 100 of his victories. I don't know how many he thought he had, but at least it shows 100 of them. And the third thing is Les Invalides is the place where Napoleon bestowed the very first Légion d'honneur. And that's an honor. It's a military and even civilian honor. He created la Légion d'honneur, and it's still given today. It's still a great honor for people today. It's one of the highest French honors you can get. These are three things that Napoleon liked about Les Invalides, but what really won the day, the argument that really won the day, was that the député said it was fitting that Napoleon should be placed under the Invalides dome, under the dome itself, with the assurance that no one else would ever replace him or join him in this grandiose spot. And here were their reasons for rejecting the other spots, the other places. Saint-Denis was rejected because they didn't want Napoleon lumped in with so many of the French kings at Saint-Denis, or with anybody else for that matter, not even anybody yet to be born. Le Panthéon was another possibility. It had too many great people. Napoleon would not stand out. No way. Place de Vendôme was not grand enough, visually, or not really old enough to have great significance. Thus, what's left is l'Arc de Triomphe, but he would be with too many other great soldiers. He needed to stand out, have a place of his own. Now, of course, there were opposing views. Some thought this would become Napoleon's shrine where worshippers could come pay homage, making him into some sort of military deity. That was not comfortable to a lot of people. There were some who said he should be left at Sainte-Hélène for at least a few decades longer. And their reasons were actually pretty good, I thought. They knew Napoleon was a complicated man. This was a time in French history where there were strong tensions between the idea of freedom and the Republic or the glorification of military strength. One député, Alphonse de Lamartine, said Napoleon was no Washington, and when it comes to his contributions to the common good, he did not deserve an imperial grave, either by birth or by deeds, which is like, ouch. And even Lafayette, who was Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, that you've all heard of, I'm sure, he was a champion for the common man, right? He was a champion in America and in France for the common man. Well, he rested in a family grave. He still does, at the Picpus Cemetery in Paris. So why drag Napoleon out of his faraway grave and put him on a pedestal now, right? Which to me makes a lot of sense, because really, Napoleon, while he espoused a lot of policies that would help the common man eventually, and some of them are still in full view and full use in France today, he was really a military strongman. And so he didn't have that same idealism towards freedom and the Republic that other people had. He wanted to establish himself as a strong leader and a strong military man, and that took over any other ideas that he might have had. So the law that passed on May 26, 1840, made provisions for three things. One, they were going to fund very generously the move and burial of Napoleon's grave at Les Invalides. Number two, they were going to provision so no other would ever be buried at Les Invalides with Napoleon, not under the dome. The deal was they could put other people at Les Invalides, but not under the dome. Number three, provisions for a statue of Napoleon on horseback. Now, this is a huge deal. I know, to my listeners, probably you haven't heard of this, but the only people who were ever shown on horseback up until then, that was reserved to royalty. You had to be at least a baron or a duke or something, and even then, I doubt very many were showed on horseback in a statue. But the député wanted to break with that tradition and grant this honor to Napoleon also. And today, all over France, you will see statues of Napoleon on his horse. Some of them are pretty famous. So three things that the député wanted to make sure happened. Napoleon's body arrived in France by sea. Obviously, there was no other way to come. On November 30th, 1840. The reburial was planned for December 15th. The name for this event was called Retour des Cendres, the return of the ashes. The authorities feared rioting by the people, so they chose to transport the body via the Seine River instead of by road, because if they had had a cortège of Napoleon's remains, between, I think he arrived near Nantes, and all the way to Paris. Oh my goodness, that would have been so many people following that, etc. So they did it in as quiet a way as they could. And really, the king, he wanted Napoleon's body he wanted the people to know that they were doing all these things to bring back Napoleon, but they didn't want too much homage and too much, they wanted to do it grandiose enough, but not so much that it would inflame people's feelings towards him. Once the body was in Paris, there was great pomp and circumstance. There, the people of Paris since they knew where the procession was going to go, they flocked there by the hundreds of thousands and possibly millions, actually. The singers from the Opera of Paris performed the Requiem by Mozart. The députés made speeches. Victor Hugo read poems, and he actually chronicled the whole thing, political shenanigans and all, in some of his books. But what's just crazy is that the sepulchre that you see today was not finished yet. It wouldn't be finished for another 20 years. And Les Invalides were open to the public between the 16th and the 24th of December, and lots and lots of people went. Now, today's French people are very divided about Napoleon still. When I was growing up in school, what we learned about Napoleon was that he was a dictator, and he was just a villain. I mean, honestly, my teachers in public French school portrayed him as a villain. And it wasn't until much later that I learned all about Napoleon and a lot more. And I thought, okay, he was a villain indeed in many ways, but not in every way. So I have to tell you this funny thing. When Elise and I started the show, we were thinking about doing a logo. The designer, the guy who did our logo, is from Russia. And he put on the top left-hand side, he put this Napoleon there. And I was so opposed to it. I was like, no, I don't want Napoleon in my logo. He's gonna... And Elise is the one who convinced me, look, Napoleon is a big figurehead of, like France. Yeah, Napoleon, yeah, he's one of the icons of France. And I finally reluctantly went for it. But it wasn't my idea. In the meantime, in the 3 years, I've learned a lot about Napoleon. I've read a lot of history, so I'm now okay with it. But at first, I wasn't. See, that's the thing. French people were very ambivalent about Napoleon. But when I went to Les Invalides recently, when I was in Paris, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. And it turned out that the place was closed by the time I got there. So I didn't go inside, but I walked all around and all that. And I would recommend that when you go to Paris, if you take bus number 64, which will take you all the way to the Eiffel Tower, bus number 69. I think I said 64 before. It's not 64, it's 69. Bus number 69 will drop you off at Les Invalides, and then you can pick it up again and go all the way to the Eiffel Tower. It's a good way to do it. So it goes between le Louvre and Les Invalides, and then Champ de Mars, the Eiffel Tower. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. See, I'm being brave. I'm dipping my toe into Napoleon. I need to not ignore that part of French history. It's not just great things. It's some things that I'm a little bit ashamed of. But they happened. There you go. That's history. Facing it is important. All right, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye. There are 4 ways you can support the show, and 2 of them will not cost you a penny. How about that for a win-win? Free, no cost to you. Make your regular purchases on Amazon using the link in the show notes or on joinusinfrance.com/Amazon or any Amazon link on the site. I get a small percentage as part of the Amazon Affiliates program. You don't pay a penny more at checkout. The trick, though, is to remember to do it. Also, free, no extra cost to you. You can click on any of the banners on the right-hand side of joinusinfrance.com before you buy the travel services you will need to come to France. I have listed affiliate partners for flights, hotels, car rentals, train tickets, tours, etc. The list will grow and expand, as time goes by. But when you go through those banner ads, you do not pay a penny more. In fact, you often get special discounts and offers because I'm always on the lookout for discounts and special offers on your behalf. But the trick again is to remember to do it and to go to the site and look at that. My preferred way to get support is via patreon.com. And why is that? Well, Patreon.com is predictable. Remember, my goal is to make enough through your support so I can reduce my work hours. When you pledge on Patreon, I know what's coming, and that greatly reduces the stress of turning away paid work to do the podcasts, you see? That's why Patreon supporters get extra perks, because being able to count on your support month after month is really precious to me. So go to patreon.com/join us for details. And that's Patreon, and join us is without any spaces or anything. And of course, you can also make a one-time donation via the Tip Your Guide button on joinusinfrance.com. Those donations are wonderful. They make my day, but I know from experience that they don't happen very often. So here you go. 4 ways to support the show. 2 that won't cost you anything, and 2 that will cost you a little bit. It's up to you how you support the show. But please remember that without your support, this show and community would have to fade away, because I'm like everybody else. I have bills to pay. Thank you very much. This episode is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Non-Derivatives International License.